Elias Whitaker slammed his fist on the table so hard the lantern shook. "Who the hell cooked this?" he roared, his voice filling every corner of the old ranch house like a clap of thunder rolling down from the Rockies. His father didn't flinch. Silas just sat there, hands wrapped around an empty bowl, and looked up at his son with something Elias hadn't seen on that old face in over 2 years. Peace. And that terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced on a mountain. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and come along for the ride. This story is going to take you somewhere real. And when you're done watching, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far the story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The winter of 1879 had been the hardest Elias Whitaker could remember, and he had lived through plenty of hard ones. He was 34 years old, built like a man who had spent every one of those years doing something with his hands. Broad shoulders, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the mountains around him, and eyes the color of dark creek water, steady, watchful, and rarely soft. He didn't talk much, didn't need to. On the Whitaker Ranch, located deep in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, words had always been sparse. Work was what mattered. Silence was what you got rewarded with at the end of a long day, and Elias had learned to call that reward enough. He had inherited the ranch from his father Silas, though inherited wasn't exactly the right word. He had taken it over piece by piece while Silas was still standing, while the older man's hands were still strong and his voice still carried weight across a field. Then the slow unraveling had begun, not all at once, but the way a rope frays, one thread at a time, until one morning you pick it up and realize there's almost nothing left holding it together. Silas Whitaker had been a force of nature once. Everyone in Colton Valley said so. He had built that ranch from nothing but raw land and stubbornness, had raised cattle and crops, and one son with nothing more than determination and the refusal to quit. But grief had a way of dismantling even the strongest men, and when Silas lost his wife, Margaret, to fever 3 winters back, something in him had quietly closed like a door being shut from the inside. He stopped eating properly. He stopped going outside. He sat in the chair by the window of his small bedroom and looked out at the fields he had once worked dawn to dusk, and the life that had animated him seemed to drain away with every season that passed. Elias had tried everything he knew how to try. He had brought the doctor out from Silverton twice. Dr. Hale had looked Silas over both times, tapped his chest, checked his color, and told Elias the same thing both times. "There's nothing wrong with his body, son. It's his will that's failing." That wasn't a diagnosis Elias knew how to treat. He had pushed food on his father. He had hired 2 different women from town to come cook and keep the house. Both had quit within 3 weeks. The first said the old man was too difficult. The second said the place felt too sad and she couldn't bear it. Elias hadn't argued with either of them. He understood what they meant, even if he would never have said it out loud himself. By November, Silas was eating so little that Ecleus had begun to lie awake at night listening for sounds from the room down the hall, afraid of what silence might mean. That was the weight he carried when he rode in from the North Field that particular evening in early December, just as the sun was dropping behind the deep peaks and the cold was settling in like something alive and mean. His horse, a reliable gray gelding named Cutter, was tired from a long day pushing cattle through knee-deep snow on the upper pasture. Elias was tired too, bone-deep tired, the kind that sleep alone can't fix. He pulled Cutter into the barn, unsaddled him, gave him feed and water, and stood there for a moment in the dim warmth of the barn with his hands braced on the stall rail. He was stalling. He knew it. Going into that house every evening had become something he dreaded, not because he didn't love his father, but because watching a man you love disappear while he's still sitting right in front of you is one of the hardest things in the world to keep doing. He pulled his coat tighter and walked across the yard. He was 3 steps from the door when he smelled it. He stopped. He stood there in the cold with one boot on the porch step and his hand halfway to the door handle, and he just breathed. There was food cooking inside that house. not the thin, barely warm soup he had been leaving on the stove for his father before riding out each morning. Real food, savory and rich, with the deep, slow smell of beef that had been cooking for hours, and something underneath it, herbs maybe, something clean and green against the heavy warmth of the broth. His first thought was that he was imagining it. His second thought was that someone had broken into his house. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The kitchen was lit up. There was a fire going in the cook stove, crackling with purpose, and a heavy pot sitting on top of it with steam rising from beneath the lid. The kitchen table, which had been bare and dusty for months, had a cloth on it. There was a lantern burning. There were 2 bowls. And sitting at that table, with both hands wrapped around one of those bowls and his eyes half closed, was Silas Whitaker. The bowl was empty. Elias stared at his father for a long moment. He could not immediately process what he was seeing. Silas was sitting up straight. He had color in his face. His expression, which had been slack and absent for so long that Elias had begun to think of it as permanent, was something different now. Something that looked impossibly like contentment. "Dad," Elias said carefully. Silas looked up. "You're letting cold air in." Elias stepped inside and closed the door. "You ate." "I did. Every drop." Silas picked up the bowl and turned it toward his son like evidence. "Best stew I've had since your mother was alive. Maybe better." "Don't tell her I said that." Elias's chest did something complicated at the mention of his mother, the almost joke, the fact that his father had made any kind of joke at all. He set his jaw against it because he wasn't a man who managed grief gracefully, and he wasn't about to start now. "Who cooked this?" he asked. Silas nodded toward the far side of the kitchen, toward the doorway that led to the short hall in the back of the house. Elias turned. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands and an expression that was carefully, deliberately neutral. She was watching him the way a person watches something unpredictable, not with fear exactly, but with calculation, readiness, the look of someone who has learned to assess a situation quickly and make decisions accordingly. She was young, mid to late 20s, he guessed. Slender, with the kind of lean quality that spoke of a long time without enough food rather than any natural constitution. Her hair was chestnut brown and pinned up in a practical way that had mostly survived whatever the day had thrown at it. She wore a plain gray dress, worn at the cuffs, and a canvas apron that wasn't hers. It was the one Elias's mother had kept on the hook by the stove. And seeing it on a stranger's body made something hot flare up in his chest before he could stop it. "Who are you?" he said. His voice came out harder than he intended. "My name is Clara Bellamy," she said. She didn't flinch. "I came to the door about 2 hours ago looking for work." "Your father let me in." Elias turned back to his father. "You let a stranger into the house." "She knocked," Silas said, as if this explained everything. "It was cold. She looked hungry. I'm old, not heartless." He paused. "Well, she looked hungry and she offered to cook supper." "I'm not going to say no to that." "Dad ate." Elias. Silas looked at him with something firm in his eyes, something that hadn't been there in a long time. "I finished the whole bowl. You have been trying to get me to eat properly for 2 months. She managed it in one evening. I suggest you think carefully before you throw her out in the snow." Elias looked back at the woman Clara Bellamy, standing in the doorway with the dish towel and the steady eyes. "Where are you from?" he said. "Missouri originally." "St. Joseph. What are you doing in Colorado?" "Looking for work." "There's work in the town Silverton." "Ouray. I tried Silverton." Something moved behind her eyes, brief and controlled. They weren't interested. "What did you do in Missouri?" "Bookkeeping, mostly. Some cooking, whatever was needed." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm good with numbers and I'm good with food. I'm also good at not being a problem, which I've found is what most people are really looking for." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without difficulty, and that surprised him. Most people, when Elias Whitaker looked at them with his full attention, found somewhere else to look. "How old are you?" he asked. 27. "You came all the way from Missouri alone?" "I did." Why? A pause, brief but real, because there was nothing left in Missouri worth staying for. He didn't press it. He knew what it meant to have nothing left worth staying for. He had built an entire life around that particular kind of understanding. "There's a room off the back of the kitchen," he said. "Small, no window, it's not much, it's inside," she said. "That's enough. I'll pay you for cooking and keeping the house." "Same as I offered the others. What happened to the others?" "They quit." She glanced around the kitchen at the stove, at the pot still gently steaming, at the clean table and the empty bowl in his father's hands. She looked back at Elias. "I don't quit," she said simply. He wanted to tell her that was exactly what the others had said. He didn't. He hung his coat on the hook by the door, not the one with his mother's apron, the other one, and went to wash his hands at the basin. "There's more in the pot," Clara said behind him, "if you want some." He did want some. The smell alone had been making his stomach ache for the last 5 minutes. But he stood at the basin with his back to the room and thought about the apron on the hook, and his father's empty bowl, and a woman he had never seen before in his life, standing in his kitchen like she had. Always been there, and he said, "I'll get it myself." "All right," she said, and there was no offense in her voice. Just acceptance. He heard her step back down the hall toward the small room. He heard the door close quietly. His father was watching him when he turned around. "Don't be an idiot," Silas said. "I'm not being an idiot. You're standing there sulking about an apron." Elias opened his mouth and closed it again. "Your mother would have liked her," Silas said. He pushed himself up from the table slowly, one hand on the wood for support. "She's got that same quality Margaret had. Walks into a mess and starts fixing it without being asked." He steadied himself and reached for his cane. "The stew is good, Elias. Have some. Stop being difficult." He made his way down the hall toward his room. Elias stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. Then he picked up a bowl, filled it from the pot, and sat down at the table. He took one spoonful. He sat very still after that. It was, without question, the best beef stew he had eaten since he was a boy, and his mother was alive, and the house was full of noise and warmth and all the things that had slowly gone quiet over the years. He stared at the wall and ate the entire bowl and didn't say a word to anyone. Clara Bellamy had learned early in life that the best way to survive in an unfamiliar place was to make yourself useful before anyone had the chance to decide you weren't. She had learned this the way most valuable lessons are learned, through hard experience and the particular kind of education that comes from having things go badly wrong. She lay on the narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen that first night and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch house, settling in the cold. The wind moved against the walls, something creaked in the ceiling. Far off she could hear cattle shifting in the barn. She thought about Silverton. She had arrived in Silverton 3 weeks earlier, after a coach journey that had taken nearly everything she had left in terms of money and endurance. She had walked into the first 3 households that had posted notices for domestic help, and been turned away from all 3 before she even finished explaining why she had come. A woman traveling alone, they said, no references. No family. Coming from somewhere else, no clear reason given. Who knows what kind of woman she is, best not to take chances. The 4th household had been more direct. "We don't hire wandering women," the man of the house had said from the doorway, looking her over with an expression that made her want to step backward. "No offense, miss, but you could be anything." She had bitten back the response that came to her, turned around, and walked back to the boarding house, where she was running out of days she could afford to stay. That night she had sat on the edge of the bed in her rented room, 4 walls, a window 50 cents a night, and made herself assess the situation the way her father had taught her to assess any problem. Calmly, without panic, look at what you have, look at what you need, and figure out the shortest line between the two. What she had, $12.40. The clothes she was wearing. A small bag with a change of dress, a comb, a leather journal, and 3 books she had carried all the way from Missouri because she couldn't bring herself to leave them behind. A working knowledge of accounts and ledgers from 3 years managing the books for a dry goods store in St. Joseph. And the ability to cook, genuinely cook, the kind of cooking that her mother had passed down to her, the same way other women passed down jewelry, as something precious and sustaining. What she needed: a job, a place to sleep, enough income to stop the bleeding. She had asked the boarding house owner the next morning if there was any work in the area outside of town. The woman, a wide, practical person named Mrs. Hennessy, had looked at her over the rim of a coffee cup and said, "There's the Whitaker Ranch. Up in the mountains about 8 miles north. Old man Whitaker's not doing well, and his son can't seem to keep help. But I'll warn you, miss, that Cowboy is not an easy man, and that house has been quiet too long. It gets to people." Clara had thanked her, paid for 3 days' accommodation she couldn't really afford, and started walking north. She had been walking for almost 5 miles when the cold got serious. The kind of cold that doesn't negotiate. She had kept moving because stopping would have been worse, and she had arrived at the gate of the Whitaker Ranch just before the light gave out entirely, her fingers numb and her boots soaked through with snow. She had stood at the door for a moment before knocking. She had given herself a brief practical speech: "You need this. You are capable. Don't apologize for existing." Knock. She knocked. The old man who opened the door was not what she expected. She had expected someone distant, the way Mrs. Hennessy's warning had suggested. Instead, Silas Whitaker looked at her from the doorway with eyes that were tired and dim but not unkind. And he looked at her the way her grandfather used to look at stray cats, like he already knew he was going to let her in. He was just working out the logistics. "I'm looking for work," she said. "I heard you might need help." Silas had looked her over slowly. Then he had looked past her at the empty yard and the dark coming down from the mountains. "You walked here," he said. "Yes, sir. From town?" "Yes, sir." He had stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," he said. "It's cold." She had gone directly to the kitchen because that was what she knew, that in any unfamiliar place, the kitchen was where you could begin to make yourself useful, and being useful was the fastest path to being kept. She had found what the kitchen held: beef in the cold box, root vegetables in the bin, herbs dried and hanging near the window, flour and salt and pepper and the other reliable things. She had taken stock the way she always took stock, methodically, without rushing, understanding that good food begins with understanding what you're working with. She had started the stew. She had brought a bowl to Silas where he sat in his chair, and she had stood nearby, not hovering, just present, while he took the first hesitant spoonful. She watched his expression change. It happened slowly, like ice thawing, the resistance in his face easing, the set of his jaw softening, and then something she hadn't expected. He closed his eyes and just sat there with the bowl in his hands, not eating, just breathing in the steam. "My wife made this," he said quietly. "Margaret. She made this every winter." Clara had been very careful with her next words. What was she like? That was the door. He had walked through it slowly, still eating, telling her about Margaret in short sentences, how she had come west from Virginia and learned to love the mountains, how she had a way of laughing that you could hear from across a field, how she had died in the spring and he still sometimes woke up expecting her to be there. Clara had listened, properly listened, not the way people listen when they're waiting for their turn to speak, but the way her mother had taught her, with her full attention, with her body still and her face open, letting the other person feel that what they were saying mattered. By the time Elias came through the door, Silas had finished the bowl. Now she lay in the small room off the kitchen and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the cowboy, the way he had looked at her, not with cruelty, exactly, but with wariness so thick it was almost a physical barrier. The way he had looked at his mother's apron on her body. The way he had said, "I'll get it myself," and turned away, and the set of his shoulders when he said it. She had seen that before, not in the same person, not the same way, but she recognized the shape of it. A man who had lost something important and was protecting the wound by refusing to let anyone near enough to accidentally touch it. She wasn't there to fix him. She wasn't there for anything except work and a roof and enough wages to get herself standing again. She understood what this was and what it wasn't, but she filed it away because information was useful and she had learned never to throw any of it away. She closed her eyes. She would be up before dawn. There was a kitchen to run and a household to learn and eat in a full bowl of stew. for the first time in what she suspected was a very long while. That was enough to begin with. The first week was a study in coexistence. Elias was up before she was, which she quickly realized was intentional on his part, not out of any particular desire to see her, but out of the habit of a man who runs his own schedule and isn't interested in rearranging it for anyone. She learned to be in the kitchen before 5 regardless, because he came through on his way to the barn, and whatever was available at that hour was what he took. And she was not about to let the man who was paying her wages go out into the cold, on a handful of cold cornbread and whatever was left from the night before. The first morning she put coffee on the stove and had eggs and salt pork ready by the time she heard his boots on the floor. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," she said, and handed him a plate. He took it. He ate standing at the counter, looking out the window at the dark yard and the faint lightning at the tops of the mountains. He didn't talk. She didn't require him to. She moved around the kitchen, preparing things for the day: bread to be started, beans to be set soaking, Silas's softer breakfast to be planned. When he was done, he set the plate in the basin and said, "Thank you," in a tone that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about saying it. "You're welcome," she said, and went back to what she was doing. That was their mornings for the first several days. Brief, practical, functional. She learned the ranch from the inside, its rhythms and its needs, the particular creakiness of the cookstove, the fact that the left burner ran hotter than the right, where the good knives were, and where the nearly useless ones had been shoved in the back of a drawer. She learned which of Elias's ranch hands came in for water, and which needed to be waved toward the barn. She learned that the bunkhouse boys would eat anything that wasn't nailed down, and she adjusted quantities accordingly. And she learned Silas. He was not easy. He was proud in the way that men of his generation were proud, bone deep, reflexive, the kind that made accepting help feel like defeat. She had to be careful. Direct offers of assistance usually resulted in a quiet rebuff. But proximity worked. If she was simply in the same room, moving around doing the things that needed doing, he would sometimes begin to talk. And if he talked, he would sometimes ask for something more: coffee, a different blanket, the window opened, that he would never have asked for if she had asked first. It was a particular kind of art. Her grandmother would have recognized it. By the 5th day, she had learned his favorite hymns, and occasionally hummed one in the kitchen, where he could hear it. She wasn't sure that was what made the difference, but that was the morning he came out to the kitchen on his own for the first time, and sat down at the table before she brought anything to him. "What are you making?" he asked. "Oatmeal, with dried apples and a little honey if you want it." "Margaret used to make that. She had good taste," Clara said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was small and rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while, but it was there. She didn't make a big thing of it. She just set the bowl in front of him and poured his coffee. Elias came in from the barn that morning just as Silas finished eating, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his father sitting at the table with an empty bowl, and something happened in the lines of his face, a quick, contained thing like a fist briefly unclenching. He looked at Clara. She was already at the stove with her back to him. "There's eggs," she said, "and the coffee's hot." She heard him pull out the chair across from his father and sit down. "What time did you get up?" Silas asked her. 4:30. "That's too early," Silas said. "Biscuits take time," she said. "She's right," Elias said, and helped himself to one from the cloth-covered basket on the table. It was the first voluntary thing he had said at breakfast that wasn't a necessity. Clara kept her eyes on the stove and quietly noted it, and said nothing. On the 8th day she found the books. Not intentionally. She had been going through the back room of the ranch office, a small, dim space off the main hall that she had been given permission to clean and organize, because the disorder in it had been bothering her since the first day, and she had been pulling things out of the battered wooden cabinet in the corner, sorting papers into piles, when she found a bundle at the very back that wasn't like the rest. The other papers were what she expected from a working ranch: bills of sale for cattle, records of seed purchased and crop harvested, accounts with the general store in Colton, correspondence with buyers and suppliers going back 20 years. She had sorted through all of it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years working with paper records and understood their language. But this bundle was different. It was tied with twine and pushed to the very back of the bottom shelf, behind a layer of other documents, in a place that was either accidental or deliberate. She set it on the table and looked at it. She untied the twine. Inside were documents she didn't immediately recognize. They were formal, officially printed with the kind of language that spoke of legal intent, and they referenced the Whitaker Ranch by its land parcel number, a number she had already noted from the other records. But the parties named in these documents were not anyone she recognized from the rest of the files. One name appeared repeatedly: the Western Territorial Land and Improvement Company. She sat down at the table. She read carefully, not skimming, but the careful, methodical reading she had learned from years of working with accounts, where a single misread figure could mean the difference between a business that was solvent and one that wasn't. The documents were agreements, land agreements, purchase agreements, theoretically, except that as she read more carefully, she found things that didn't sit right, numbers that didn't match what was listed in the ranch's own records, dates that didn't align with anything in the correspondence files, and signatures that, when she compared them to other documents in the cabinet where Silas Whitaker had signed his name over the years, looked like a man who had signed under considerable pressure, or possibly had not signed at all. She went back to the cabinet and pulled out every other document she could find. She worked for the rest of the afternoon. By the time the light through the one small window in the office had faded to near nothing, and she heard Elias's boots on the porch outside, she had laid out every relevant paper across the table in a pattern she understood, and had begun to understand something much larger and much more dangerous than she had expected to find in a cluttered back room on a ranch in the mountains. She heard the front door open. She heard him stop in the kitchen, probably looking for her, probably noting that there was no supper started and finding that unusual. "Miss Bellamy?" She stood up. Her back ached from bending over the table. She moved to the office doorway. He was in the hall, still in his coat, with the cold still coming off him. "I was cleaning the back office," she said. "I found something you need to see." He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there made him cross the hall in 3 strides and stop at the office doorway. He looked at the papers spread across the table. "What is this?" he said. "That," Clara said, "is someone trying to take your ranch." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man who has just heard something that changes the shape of everything. Elias stepped into the office. He picked up the document on top, the first agreement, the one with the earliest date, and read it. His jaw tightened. He set it down and picked up another. Then another. His hands were very still as he read, and Clara had already learned that stillness in him was not calm. It was the opposite of calm. It was the controlled surface over something that was moving very fast underneath. "These are signed by my father," he said. His voice was flat. "Some of them have signatures," she said carefully. "I'd like you to look at them against other documents where your father signed his name. I've marked the places." He looked at what she had laid out. He looked at the signatures she had placed side by side. He was not an educated man in the formal sense, she already knew that, but he was sharp, and he had his father's handwriting in his memory from a lifetime of reading it. He put the papers down. "That's not his signature," he said. "No," she said, "I don't think it is." He stood there. She watched him, could see it happening, the way the pieces were landing in sequence, and the picture they were forming. "This company," he said, "the Western Territorial." "I've heard the name," Clara said, "in Silverton. They're out of Denver. They've been acquiring land throughout the region, mostly from ranches that are struggling." She paused. "I didn't realize the connection until I saw these documents." He looked at her. "How do you know about them?" "I pay attention," she said. "And I read everything I can get my hands on. There was a notice posted in the boarding house in Silverton about a meeting ranchers who'd received notices from that company. I didn't think it had anything to do with me at the time." He looked back at the papers. "How long has this been going on?" he said. His voice had dropped. "Based on these dates, at least 2 years." She kept her voice level. She knew what she was saying and what it meant, possibly longer. Some of these agreements appear to give them option rights over portions of your land. If they're not challenged, they could use them to make a legal claim. On my ranch, on parts of it, potentially significant parts. He put his hands flat on the table and stood there with his head down for a moment. My father, he said quietly. Not a question. He may not have known what he was signing, Clara said. If he was approached during the worst of his grief, if someone presented documents and told him they were something other than what they were. She stopped. I don't know. But what I can tell you is that the pattern in these documents matches what I've seen described in similar cases. It's not accidental. He straightened. He picked up the bundle of documents and turned to face her. Can you go through all of these and tell me exactly what they claim, he said. I already have, she said. I can write it out clearly if you want it written. He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't entirely read his expression. It was too controlled, too layered. But there was something in it that hadn't been there in the days before. Something that was making a recalculation. How did you know to look at the signatures, he said. Discrepancy, she said simply. The dates some of these agreements don't match the physical condition of the paper. If a document is 2 years old, it should look 2 years old. Some of these don't. She paused, and the numbers are wrong. The acreage they describe doesn't match your property records. Someone made errors or they didn't expect anyone to check. He said nothing for a moment. Then, you did all of this afternoon? I work quickly when something interests me, she said. He looked down at the papers in his hands. She saw the muscle move in his jaw. My father has been carrying this, he said quietly. Alone. While he stopped, he may not have known, she said again. Or he may have known and thought it was too late to fight. Elias Whitaker looked up at her. Is it too late, he said. She held his gaze. Not yet, she said. He nodded once. The way he nodded when he had made a decision. She was already beginning to recognize that particular motion, and he walked past her down the hall. She heard him knock on his father's bedroom door. She heard Silas's voice, quiet and questioning. She heard Elias say, carefully, evenly, Dad, I need to talk to you about some papers I found. Don't be upset. I just need to understand some things. And then she heard the door close, and she stood alone in the office with the papers spread out around her, and she understood that everything that came after this moment was going to be different from everything that had come before. She sat back down. She picked up her pencil. She started writing. Elias Whitaker did not sleep that night. Clara knew because she heard him. The old ranch house was quiet enough that sound traveled boots on floorboards, the low murmur of men talking behind a closed door, the creak of a chair shifted on the front room floor. She lay on her cot and listened to the rhythm of it without meaning to, and somewhere around midnight the voices stopped and the boots went still, but she still heard movement, the specific. Restless movement of a man pacing in small circles who had nowhere useful to put what he was feeling. She understood that kind of night. She'd had several of her own. At 4:30 she got up, dressed in the dark, and went to the kitchen. By the time Elias appeared in the doorway at 5, the coffee was ready and she had bacon in the pan. He looked like a man who had been through something physical, not battered, but stripped of the controlled distance he usually kept between himself and the world. His eyes were different, more open, the kind of open that only comes when a person has spent the dark hours facing something they can't wall off. He sat down at the table without being asked, which he had never done before. She poured his coffee and set it in front of him and went back to the stove. He knew, Elias said. She kept her hands moving. What did he know? Not everything, but more than I thought. His voice was rough from a night of talking and probably no sleep. He said a man came out here about 2 years ago, suit and hat, very proper, very official. Said he was from a land management company out of Denver. Said the county had reclassified some of the northern parcels, and Dad needed to sign some forms to protect our claim. Dad was 3 months out from losing my mother. He paused. He said he didn't read them. He said he trusted that anyone who came with that kind of paperwork and that kind of language was on the level. Clara turned from the stove. He signed without reading them. He was grieving and alone, and someone sat down across from him at this table and used words like official reclassification and protective filing. His jaw was set hard. He thought he was protecting the ranch. He was trying to do the right thing, she said carefully. He's been thinking for 2 years that he did something wrong. That he was foolish, that he'd lost parts of the ranch through his own stupidity. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and stared at the table. He didn't say that last night, but I know him. That's what he's been carrying. Clara set a plate down in front of him and sat across the table, which she had never done before either. She folded her hands on the tablecloth and thought for a moment. Elias, she said it was the first time she had used his first name, and she saw him notice it, a brief flicker in his eyes. What happened to your father isn't stupidity. It's what happens when someone who is skilled at deception finds someone who is in pain and uses that pain as a door. That's not a character failing, that's a crime. He looked at her. Can we fight it, he said. I think so, but not the way you'd want to fight it. What does that mean? It means going at them directly won't work. Not yet. They have lawyers and money and an arrangement that looks legal on paper even if it isn't. If you walk into their office and throw those documents at them, they'll tie it up in language until you run out of time and resources. She kept her voice steady. What they did was wrong, but wrong doesn't automatically mean fixable unless you know exactly how to show it. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, the natural impulse toward direct action fighting against the logic of what she was saying. You said you've seen this before, he said. I've seen the shape of it. In Missouri, I kept books for a man named Aldous Freer. He ran a dry goods operation, but he also had land holdings, and at one point someone came after one of his parcels using the same general approach official language, legitimate-looking paperwork. Pressure applied at a moment of vulnerability. She paused. I helped him build the case to fight it. We won, but it took 3 months and every document we could find. 3 months, Elias repeated. Maybe less, if the documents I found last night are as clear as I think they are. She met his eyes. But I need to go through everything, not just what was in that cabinet. Tax records, county filings, anything that touches those parcels. And I need to know if anyone else in this valley has been approached by the Western Territorial Company. Something shifted in his expression, a door opening slightly that had been firmly closed before. I can find that out, he said. Quiet, she said. Don't tell people what you found yet, just ask. See who else has had visitors from Denver in the last couple of years. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that look she felt him doing what she had felt him doing since the first night assessing her, filing information, recalibrating. He was a careful man beneath the straightforward surface. She was learning. He didn't accept things quickly, but when he accepted them, it was fully. All right, he said. He ate his breakfast. She refilled his coffee. When he stood to go, he stopped at the door. Miss Bellamy, he said. Clara, she said, because she had already used his name and it seemed unbalanced not to. He looked at her over his shoulder. Clara. He seemed to try the word out, hold it briefly, find it acceptable. Thank you for last night, for finding it. I was cleaning a cabinet, she said simply. The corner of his mouth moved. It was barely anything, not quite a smile. Not quite not a smile, but it was there, and it was the first time she had seen anything like it on his face. And it stayed with her after the door closed behind him, and she was alone in the kitchen with the sound of the wind picking up outside. She sat there for just one moment. Then she got up and went to find Silas's breakfast, because there was work to do and the morning wasn't going to wait. Silas was already awake when she came to his door. Already dressed, which surprised her in a way that suggested he had been dressed for some time. Come in, he said when she knocked. He was sitting in the chair by the window. But he wasn't looking out at the fields the way he usually did, with that absent inward expression. He was looking at her directly when she came through the door, and there was something alert in him that hadn't been there the day before. He talked to you this morning, Silas said. Yes. About what we talked about last night. Yes. Silas was quiet for a moment. I should have told him 2 years ago. You were protecting him, she said. I was ashamed. He said it plainly, without sentiment. There's a difference. He looked at his hands. They were large hands, still capable looking even now, and she could see in them the ghost of what he had been, the man who had built this ranch from opened land with those hands. I've been sitting in this room thinking I'd done something foolish and unforgivable, and so I sat here and waited to die. That's the truth of it. You didn't do something foolish, she said. Someone deceived you deliberately. That's what Elias said last night. He glanced at her. He said you explained it that way. It's the accurate explanation. Maybe, he shifted in his chair, but accurate or not, I still signed the papers. And now my son has to fight for what should have been straightforward. He will, she said, and so will I. Silas looked at her. Really looked at her the way he hadn't fully done before. Why, he said, you don't owe us anything. You've been here 9 days. Because it's wrong, she said. And then, because he was the kind of man who deserved a straight answer, and she was the kind of woman who gave them, and because this place deserves better than what someone tried to do to it. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, What do you need from me? Everything you remember about the man who came here 2 years ago. What he looked like, what he said, exactly what he asked you to sign and how he explained it. Every detail, even things that seem small. I have a good memory, Silas said. I know, she said, that's why I'm asking. She went back to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of coffee and paper and a pencil, and she sat across from Silas Whitaker, and she wrote down everything he said, and he talked for almost 2 hours. And by the end of it she had 6 pages of notes, and a picture that was clearer and darker than she had expected. The man who had come to the door was named Harlan Cross. He had identified himself as a county land assessor. He had been polite, well-dressed, and utterly convincing, and he had brought with him a young man who seemed to serve as a witness, and who had signed his name on several documents as well. He had told Silas the filings were routine, protective. That not signing would put the ranch at risk of the very thing the documents were supposedly preventing. Did he come back? Twice, Silas said. Both times with more papers. I signed everything he brought. I thought, he stopped. I thought I was being responsible. And after that, nothing, no contact. I assumed it had all been settled. Then about 6 months ago I started getting notices. From a company out of Denver, referencing the agreements. Saying they were preparing to exercise certain rights under the terms. I didn't fully understand them. I put them in the cabinet. Clara went still. You received notices? Several. Where are they? He pointed to the cabinet on the far wall. Bottom drawer. I didn't want Elias to find them. She went to the cabinet. She opened the bottom drawer. There was a bundle of papers tied with the same kind of twine as the ones she'd found the night before. She untied it and looked at the top document and understood immediately why Silas had been shutting down, had been sitting in this room watching himself disappear. He had believed the fight was already lost before it began. She read through all of them. Then she sat back on her heels on the floor of Silas's room, with the papers in her lap, and thought very carefully. Because what she was looking at was not, as it appeared at first, a set of legitimate legal notices. It was pressure. It was what came after the initial deception, a second layer designed to make the target feel that resistance was impossible, that the law was already settled against them, that the most sensible thing to do was simply accept the terms. But there were mistakes in these documents too. Different mistakes than the ones she'd found the night before. But mistakes nonetheless. The statute numbers cited were incorrect. The county jurisdiction referenced was wrong. Someone had been careful with the initial forgery and sloppier with the follow-up, perhaps because they believed by this point that the old man was already broken enough that he wouldn't look closely. They had been right about that part. They hadn't anticipated her. She looked up at Silas. He was watching her from his chair with the same expression she was learning to recognize, the one he used when he was waiting to see what she would do next. These are wrong, she said. The legal references are wrong. Deliberately, I think, but wrong enough to matter. He was quiet. Silas, she said, and she used his name without thinking, the same way she had used Elias's that morning, and he didn't object. "This is not over. I want you to understand that. This is not over, and you did not lose this ranch." Something moved in the old man's face. It moved slowly, like something frozen working its way loose. "You sound very certain," he said. "I am certain," she said. Because she was. She had learned to be sure of the things she was sure of and honest about the ones she wasn't, and right now she was very sure. "But I need you to do something for me. Name it." "I need you to start eating properly and getting out of this room," she said, "because when we take this to the county office, I want you standing next to your son, and I want you looking like the man who built this ranch, not the man who's been hiding from it." The silence that followed was long enough that she started to wonder if she had overstepped. Silas Whitaker was not a man who was spoken to directly about his own retreat from the world. She braced for it. Instead he said, "That's the most anyone's talked to me like a person in 2 years." "I'll take that as a yes," she said. He almost smiled. "Take it however you want." She gathered the papers, stood, and went to find Elias. She found him in the barn 20 minutes later, working on a section of fence line that had come down in the barn's interior. Practical, physical work, the kind he clearly used when he needed to do something with his hands. He heard her come in and didn't stop. "I found more," she said. He kept working. "How much more?" "Your father had been receiving notices from the company for 6 months. He hid them." Elias's hand stopped. He set down the tool he was holding slowly. "He didn't tell me. He thought it was too late. He thought signing the original documents meant the battle was already decided against him." She paused. "It's not, but Elias, the notices have errors, legal errors. Whoever wrote them made assumptions about what your father would and wouldn't check. They assumed he was beaten enough to accept them without scrutiny." He turned around. "Can we use them?" "Yes. But I need to check one more thing. I need to know if anyone else in this valley received similar notices. Because if this company has been running the same operation on multiple ranches," she held his gaze, "that's not a land dispute anymore. That's a pattern. And a pattern is harder to deny than one set of questionable documents." He was already nodding before she finished speaking. "I'm going to Colton tomorrow. There are 3 ranchers I need to talk to. Be careful what you say. I know how to have a conversation, Clara." There was the smallest edge of wry in his voice, dry and brief, and it surprised her into a pause. "I know you do," she said. Something passed between them in the moment after that. She wasn't sure what to call it exactly, and she wasn't interested in naming it, but it was there. Brief and real. "I'll have the stew ready when you're back," she said, and she turned and walked back to the house before she could think too much about it. The next several days moved fast. Elias rode to Colton and came back with a face that was hard to read and information that wasn't. He had spoken to 2 of the 3 ranchers he'd gone to find. Both had received visits from a well-dressed man with official paperwork. One had signed documents and was already in the process of what he'd been told was a land protection agreement. The other had refused on instinct and had been receiving threatening letters from a Denver address ever since. They targeted the ones who were struggling, Elias said that evening at the kitchen table. He had maps of the valley spread across the surface, his father's land records beside them. Clara was across the table with her notes, and Silas at the far end. Sitting upright, he had been at the table for every evening meal for the past 5 days, which was a quiet revolution in itself. Every ranch that got approached was going through something. Loss, bad family trouble. They watch for weakness, Silas said flatly. Like any predator. The rancher who refused, did he keep the letters? Clara asked. Said he had a box of them. I need to see them. She looked at Elias. Can you get them? I'll ride back out Thursday. She nodded and went back to the notes in front of her, and for a few minutes the 3 of them sat at the table in the kind of quiet that was not empty. It was purposeful, shared. The quiet of people working toward the same thing. You were a bookkeeper, Silas said after a while, watching her. For several years, yes. In Missouri, yes. What brought you to Colorado? He asked. Not aggressively, just wanting to know. She looked up from her papers. She considered what to say for a moment, and then she made the decision she always made when she was asked that question by someone she had decided to trust. I worked for a man named Douglas Crane, she said. Dry goods. I kept his books for 3 years. I was good at it, and he knew I was good at it, and that worked fine for a long time. She kept her voice even. Then I found an error that turned out to be more than an error. Money moving in ways that it shouldn't. I told him what I found because I thought that was the right thing to do. And Silas said, he dismissed me, told me I was mistaken. Then he told people in town I was unreliable and difficult to work with. She let that sit for a moment. By the time I understood what was happening, I had no position, no references that weren't already poisoned, and a town that had decided to believe him over me, because he had a business and a name, and I was just the girl who kept his books. Elias had gone very still across the table. So you left, Silas said. I stayed another 4 months trying to fix it, she said. Then I left, because sometimes the only way forward is to go somewhere nobody has already decided who you are. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. He was stealing from his own business, Elias said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. From his business partners, she said. 2 of them. I found the records that proved it. I left copies with both partners before I went, anonymously, because I thought they deserved to know even if I couldn't do anything else about it. She paused. I don't know if they ever did anything with them. You gave them the information and walked away, Elias said. I gave them the truth. What they do with it isn't something I can control. He looked at her across the maps and the papers and the lamp burning between them. And then you walked 8 miles in the snow, he said slowly, to knock on a stranger's door and cook supper because you needed work. That's about the size of it, she said. Silas made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough to count. Elias held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he looked back down at the maps and said, We're going to get those letters Thursday. And then we're going to figure out what to do next. He said we. Clara noticed it and chose not to point it out, but she noticed it. Thursday came, and Elias rode to get the letters, and he came back with a box that held 37 pieces of correspondence spanning 14 months. Clara spent that evening and the next morning going through every one of them and cross-referencing them with the documents from the Whitaker Ranch, and what she found made the whole picture suddenly very clear and very large. The Western Territorial Land and Improvement Company had been running the same operation on at least 6 ranches in the valley. The approach was identical in every case: official visit, misleading documents, signatures obtained under false pretenses, followed by letters claiming legal rights that didn't exist under any correct reading of the actual law. The errors Clara had noted in the Whitaker documents appeared in the letters from the other ranches, too. Same language, same incorrect statute references, same pattern. Someone was running a scheme, and they were running it with the confidence of people who believed that mountain ranchers were uneducated, isolated, and too proud or too frightened to seek help. She brought everything to the kitchen table and laid it out for Elias and Silas that evening, and walked them through it, piece by piece. When she finished, Elias sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. How many ranches, he said. At least 6 based on these documents. Possibly more. How much land, if all the claims they're asserting were allowed to stand thousands of acres? Spread across the whole valley. Silas put his hand flat on the table. This is not a land dispute, he said. He looked at Elias. This is a theft, yes, Clara said. What do we do? Elias said, and he was looking at her when he said it, not at his father, not at the papers, at her, directly, with the kind of look that said he had already made a decision about where the thinking on this needed to come from. She held his gaze. She thought about Douglas Crane and the 4 months she had spent trying to fix something that one powerful man had decided wasn't going to be fixed. She thought about the partners she'd left the documents for, anonymously, not knowing if it would do any good. She thought about 37 letters in a box and 6 ranches, and a company that had decided mountain people were easy targets. We go to the county seat, she said, not just you, all of you. Every rancher who was targeted. We go together, with every document, organized and clearly presented, and we present the pattern. Not just one ranch's disputed papers, which they can explain away. The whole picture. She looked around the table. They can dismiss one rancher's complaint. They can't dismiss 6. Elias looked at her for a long moment. You'd come with us? The question surprised her more than it should have. She took a breath. Those are your documents to present, she said carefully. Your case, your ranch, you put it together, he said simply. I did the bookkeeping, she said Clara. His voice was quiet and direct. I'm asking if you'll come. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the road that had brought her here, all the doors that had closed, all the rooms that had decided before she finished speaking that she wasn't worth listening to. She thought about Silas in his chair watching the fields go by. She thought about what it had cost him to sign those papers and then spend 2 years believing he was foolish for doing it. Yes, she said, I'll come. Silas reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly. It was the gesture of a man who had been a father once and still remembered how. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Elias nodded once. Then he began to talk logistics when they would ride, who they would contact, what order to present the documents in, and Clara listened and added detail where she had it, and Silas sat at the head of the table and listened to both of them. And outside the window the mountains were dark and cold and enormous under the winter sky. But inside the kitchen the lamp burned steady, and for the first time since Clara Bellamy had knocked on the door of the Whitaker Ranch 12 days before, something that had been very quiet in the old house began, slowly and without announcement, to feel like it was becoming something else entirely. They rode out on a Thursday morning, 4 days after Clara had spread the last of the documents across the kitchen table and said the word that changed everything, together. Elias had spent those 4 days doing what he did best when a problem needed solving, moving. He rode to 3 neighboring ranches, not announcing what he had found, just asking questions the way a man asks when he's comparing notes rather than building a case. He came back each evening with more pieces, and Clara added them to what she already had. And by Wednesday night the picture was so clear and so damning that she had to sit with it alone for an hour, just to make sure she wasn't seeing more than was actually there. She wasn't. It was all there, 6 ranches, 14 months. 37 letters and a stack of forged documents that, when laid side by side, told a story so consistent that it couldn't be anything but deliberate. Silas came to breakfast on Thursday dressed in his good shirt, the dark one he wore to church, when he still went, and his boots were cleaned. Elias saw it and said nothing, but Clara watched something move through him when he looked at his father standing upright at the kitchen door, and she turned back to the stove before either of them noticed her noticing. They were 3 ranchers in the end, who made the ride to the county seat at Silverton. Elias and Silas from the Whitaker Ranch. A man named Orville Potts from the spread 2 valleys over a broad, quiet man in his late 50s, who had received 12 of the threatening letters and hadn't shown them to anyone because he was too angry and too ashamed in equal measure. And a 3rd rancher, Pete Alderman, younger, sharper-tongued, who had refused to sign anything and had been threatening for 6 months to do exactly what they were now doing, except that he'd had no one to do it with and no documents to back him up. Clara rode with them. She had not owned a horse in 2 years, but it turned out that was not something you forgot, and she kept pace without difficulty. The leather satchel with all the organized documents strapped across her body, because she was not letting those papers out of reach for any reason. Orville Potts rode beside her for the first hour without saying much. Then he looked over and said, "Elias tells me you put this all together." "I organized what was already there," she said. "He says you're the reason we know what we're dealing with." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "What are we dealing with, in your view, mister?" "Potts?" He chewed on that for a moment. "Thieves," he said. "Wearing suits. That's the accurate version," she said. He nodded slowly. "My wife said I should have fought it months ago. I told her I didn't have grounds." He paused. "She's going to say she told me so." "Let her," Clara said. She was right. He laughed a short, rough sound, and after that he seemed to relax, and the rest of the ride was easier. The county office in Silverton was a 2-story building that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the clerk at the front desk was a young man of about 22, who looked at the group of them walking through the door, 4 adults. 3 of them ranchers in work coats. One of them a woman with a leather satchel, with the expression of someone who was not sure what he was dealing with. Elias spoke first. "We need to see the county land recorder. Today, we have a legal matter involving multiple land parcels in the valley and documented evidence of fraud." The word fraud landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "I'll need to the recorder is in a meeting. Then we'll wait," Elias said. He sat down. The others sat down. Clara remained standing, and she held the clerk's gaze long enough that he turned around and went down the hall. They waited 40 minutes. Clara used the time to go through her notes one more time, making sure the presentation order was exactly right. Silas sat beside Orville Potts and they talked in low voices about cattle prices and the conversation of men who have lived parallel lives in the same country and recognize each other in the particulars. Pete Alderman paced by the window. Elias watched Clara. She felt him watching, but she didn't look up. She needed to think. The county land recorder was a man named Gerald Fitch, 50s, gray-whiskered, with the careful eyes of someone who had been in his position long enough to have seen most things. He came down the hall and looked at all of them and said, "This must be serious." "It is," Elias said. They were shown into a meeting room. Clara laid the documents out on the table in the order she had planned, and then she talked. She did not use emotional language. She did not make accusations she couldn't immediately support with paper. She walked Gerald Fitch through the timeline, the pattern, the specific errors in the legal citations, the forged signatures, the systematic targeting of ranches that were in vulnerable situations, and the 37 letters that had followed the initial deceptions. Fitch listened. He was the kind of man who listened with his whole body leaning forward slightly, eyes moving between her face and the documents, occasionally picking something up to examine more closely, and then setting it back exactly where he found it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Fitch sat back in his chair. "The statute numbers in these notices," he said slowly. "You cross-referenced them against the actual state land code?" "Yes," she said. "I've noted the correct statutes beside each incorrect citation. None of the legal authority they claim to have is based on real law." "And the signatures." He picked up the comparison sheet she had prepared. "You're saying these are forged. I'm saying they don't match any verified signature of Silas Whitaker across 20 years of ranch documents that I reviewed. I've flagged 8 specific variations." She paused. "I'm not a handwriting expert, but those comparisons are clear enough that someone who should look at them." Fitch looked at Silas. "Mr. Whitaker, is this your signature?" Silas leaned forward and looked at the document Fitch was holding. His jaw tightened. "It is not, you're certain." "I have signed my name the same way for 50 years, Silas said quietly. "I am certain." Fitch set the document down very carefully. "How many ranches did you say were affected?" he said. "At least 6 that we know of," Clara said. "There may be more. We only had access to the ranchers willing to speak with us." Fitch looked at Elias, then at Orville Potts, then at Pete Alderman, who had been sitting very still with his arms crossed for the entire presentation, radiating a controlled fury that Clara had found oddly reassuring. Then Fitch looked back at the papers. "The Western Territorial Land and Improvement Company," he said, almost to himself. "They've filed in this county before on other matters." Something moved behind his eyes. "Leave these documents with me, all of them. I want certified copies made today and the originals held in our records vault." He looked at Clara. "Do you have a summary written out? The pattern you described?" She reached into the satchel and withdrew 6 pages of dense, careful handwriting. "Right here." He took it. He read the first page and the second and looked up. "You wrote this? When? Last night?" He looked at her the way people had been looking at her since she laid the first document on Gerald Fitch's table, with something recalibrating behind their eyes, some adjustment being made to whatever assumption had preceded it. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "what is your occupation?" "Currently," she said, "I keep house for the Whitaker Ranch." Something almost like a smile crossed his face and disappeared. "I see," he said. "Well, What you've assembled here is more organized than half of what our own office produces, and the legal analysis is sound enough that I intend to have our county attorney look at it this afternoon." He stood. "I'll need all of you to be available to make statements. Formally on the record. Can you do that today?" The ranchers looked at each other. "We can do that today," Elias said. They were in the county office for 3 hours. Statements were taken. Documents were copied. Gerald Fitch disappeared twice to consult with people further down the hall, and came back each time with a slightly more serious expression than he'd had when he left. By the time they walked back out into the cold afternoon air, Clara's hand ached from the amount she'd written. Orville Potts stopped on the steps outside. He looked at Clara. "My wife is going to want to meet you," he said. "Tell her I said hello," Clara said. Alderman shook Elias's hand and then, after a brief pause, extended his hand to Clara as well. She shook it. "I've been tricked to do this for 6 months," he said. "I didn't know how to make it stick. You figured that out in 2 weeks. "I had good documents to work with," she said. "That's gracious of you," he said, and she could hear that he meant it. He tipped his hat and walked toward his horse. Orville followed, which left Elias and Silas and Clara standing on the steps of the county office in the cold, and the silence that settled between the three of them was different from any silence that had come before. Silas reached out and put his hand briefly on Clara's shoulder. It was a small gesture and a large one at the same time. "Margaret would have liked you," he said. "I've said that once already. I don't usually say things twice. Then I'll take it as a significant compliment," she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh and went to find his horse. Elias stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. She had noticed that about him, that he didn't fill silences just to fill them, that he waited until he had something real to say. She had found it disconcerting at first, and now found it the opposite. "That went better than I expected," he said finally. "Fitch is a good man," she said. "You can tell the difference when someone is actually listening versus managing you." He was actually listening. "He was listening to you," Elias said. There was nothing pointed in the observation. It was simply accurate. "He was listening to the documents," she said. "You built the case that made the documents tell the story." He turned to look at her directly. The afternoon light was doing something to his features that made him look less guarded than usual, though she wasn't sure if it was the light or something else. "I want you to know I understand that." She met his eyes. "What happens now?" Fitch said 2 to 3 weeks for the county attorney to review and decide whether to open a formal investigation. If they do, the company's claims on all the affected parcels get suspended pending resolution. He paused. That means no one can be pushed off their land in the meantime. And if the investigation proceeds, then we go from suspended to dismissed, hopefully. He was quiet for a moment. "And whoever ran this scheme answers for it," she nodded. She turned to go find her horse. "Clara," she stopped. "Why did you walk 8 miles in the snow?" he said. "Really, you could have gone back east. You had enough for a coach fare." She turned back around. He was watching her with the steady, patient attention that she had stopped finding unnerving somewhere around the 2nd week. "Because going back east would have meant going back to a version of my life that was already finished," she said. "And moving forward, even into something unknown, seemed more honest than pretending I could return to something that wasn't there anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "How long were you married?" he said. She went very still. "What makes you say that?" she said carefully. "The way you talk about Missouri. There's something you don't say." He held her gaze without apology. "You don't have to answer." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, 3 years. His name was Thomas. He died of fever the same winter your mother died." She kept her voice even. "He was a good man. The store was his. When he died, it went to his brother, because that's how those things worked. And I went from being the wife of the owner to being a charity case in someone else's house." She paused. "I was not willing to be that, so you left, so I left." He nodded slowly, and in the nod she could see him absorbing it, filing it, making room for it in the picture he was building. "I'm sorry about Thomas," he said. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. He blinked a small, brief thing. the kind that happens when something lands more precisely than expected. "Eleanor," he said, "fever, same as your Thomas 5 years ago." "I know," she said quietly. "Your father told me." "He talks to you," Elias said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite disbelief, more like a man acknowledging something he has watched happen and still hasn't entirely understood. "He talks," she said. "I listen. That's usually all it takes." He stood there for a moment longer. The cold was settling in around them, the way it did in the mountains in late afternoon, serious and efficient, and they were both ignoring it. "I don't know what happens next," he said, "with the county case." "With any of it. Neither do I," she said, "but we built the best case we could with what we had, and it was a good case." "That's all you can do." "Come on," she said. "Your father is waiting and it's cold, and I have no idea what's in the kitchen, so someone needs to figure out supper." He followed her. She heard it in his footsteps, the sound of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and is not yet sure how to put it down, but is beginning, very tentatively, to try. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of Clara's life, and also in ways she hadn't expected, the best. Strange because they were waiting, which is never comfortable, and the waiting was interrupted by things that kept the tension alive. A rider arrived at the ranch on the 5th day with a letter addressed to Silas, no return address, formal language, informing him that the Western Territorial Land and Improvement Company was aware that certain parties had raised questions with county officials and that any interference with legitimate business arrangements would be met with legal response. Clara read it twice and set it aside and told Elias what it said. "They're watching," he said. "They're worried," she said. "There's a difference. Worried people make threats. People who aren't worried don't bother." He looked at the letter. "Should we be concerned? We should be aware," she said. "Keep the horses in at night. Make sure the ranch hands know not to let anyone onto the property they don't recognize." He nodded and went to do exactly that. The second strange thing happened on the 9th day, when Orville Potts rode in unexpectedly around midday and came straight to the house with the expression of a man who has news he isn't sure how to carry. Clara was in the kitchen when he knocked. She called him in and put coffee on and waited. "There's a man in Colton asking questions," Orville said, wrapping his hands around the coffee mug. "About you." He looked at Clara. "About where you came from and who hired you, and whether anyone knows you well enough to speak for your character." The words landed like something cold. "What kind of questions?" she said. Her voice was steady, the kind that are trying to build a case that the documents are unreliable because the person who organized them is unreliable. He met her eyes directly. "I heard it from the barber, who heard it from one of the men at the feed store, who said the fellow asking questions was well-dressed and had a Denver way of speaking." She stood very still. Elias came in from the barn 15 minutes later and found her sitting at the table with the coffee mug in both hands and Orville on the other side, and he read the room correctly in about 3 seconds. "What happened?" he said. Clara told him. His expression did not change dramatically. It went from neutral to quiet in a way that was somehow more serious than anger would have been. "They're trying to undermine you," he said. "They're trying to undermine the case," she said carefully. "And the most efficient way to do that is to establish that the person who built it can't be trusted." "What did they find?" he said. "In Missouri. I don't know what they're looking for." "But there's nothing to find, that's true." She looked at him directly. "There may be things Crane told people about me that aren't true." "That's different, Crane," Elias said. "The man who dismissed you." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Write down everything Crane did. Every detail you remember. The money you found, how you found it, what you told him, what he told you, what happened after." He paused. "And give me the names of the 2 partners you left the documents for." "Elias, if they're going to come after your reputation, we need to be able to answer them," he said. Not defensively, with facts. He held her gaze. "That's your own advice, by the way." She stared at him. "You told me you can't fight them with anger alone," he said. "You need proof." "Well, so do they, and right now they don't have any about you." "Let's make sure they can't build one from Crane's lies." She sat back in her chair. She felt something move through her, that she wasn't prepared for the specific disorienting sensation of being defended by someone she had not expected to defend her. "I'll write it down," she said. "Good." He looked at Orville. "Was there anything else? Did this man make any approach to the ranchers directly?" "Not yet," Orville said, "but I'd wager he will." "If anyone comes to you asking about Miss Bellamy," Elias said, and his voice was the quiet, iron-certain voice she had learned to pay attention to, "you tell them she walked 8 miles in a mountain winter to help a family she'd never met. And that what she found and what she put together is sitting in the county office right now in black and white. And then you tell them that if they have questions about her character, they can bring them to me." Orville looked at Elias for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. "He always liked this?" she asked. "Pretty much," Orville said. "I see," she said. Elias ignored both of them and went to pour his own coffee, which he did without asking, which Clara noticed, because 3 weeks ago he wouldn't have reached for anything in the kitchen without it feeling like a negotiation. Things were shifting. She was aware of it. She was trying to be sensible about it and not read more into it than what was actually there. But she was also honest enough with herself to admit that the boundaries of what this was her position, her role, what she was doing on this ranch and why had become less clear than they had been when she first arrived. She stayed focused on the work. The work was what was real. What was also real was that Silas had started working in the barn again. Small things within his capacity, but he was outside and he was moving and he was talking to the ranch hands in the morning the way a man talks when he remembers he has something to say. The hands had taken notice. A couple of the older ones, who had been with the ranch for years, began checking in with him in the afternoons, just to talk. Clara watched this happen from the kitchen window, without saying anything about it. One afternoon she came out to the barn to bring lunch to the hands and found Silas telling a story, some account of a cattle drive from 20 years back. The kind that had probably been told and retold and gotten better every time. And 3 of the younger hands were sitting on a fence rail listening, like it was the most important thing they'd heard all week. She set the food down quietly and went back to the house and stood in the kitchen for a moment, with her hands flat on the counter. He was coming back, and on the 15th day, the letter arrived from the county office. It was addressed to Elias Whitaker, and it was from Gerald Fitch, and Elias read it standing at the kitchen table, while Clara and Silas watched him. His face when he finished reading was very still, Silas said. Elias looked up. "The county attorney has reviewed the documents," he said. "They've opened a formal investigation into the Western Territorial Land and Improvement Company for fraudulent misrepresentation and falsification of land agreements across the valley." He paused. "All claimed rights asserted by the company against any of the named properties are suspended pending resolution." Effective immediately, the room was quiet. Silas put both hands on the table and lowered his head. It was the gesture of a man who has been carrying something for so long that the sudden absence of the weight is almost more than he can process. Clara did not move. Elias set the letter down and looked at her. "You built that case," he said. "We built it," she said. "All of us, Clara." His voice was quiet and direct. "Look at me." She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. And then, because he was a man who meant what he said, for all of it. "The stew, the cabinet, the 37 letters, the 6 pages you wrote the night before we went to Silverton. For coming with us," he paused. "For staying." The word staying landed differently than the others. She held his gaze and felt the word settle into the room, and tried very hard to think clearly about what it meant and what it didn't, and mostly she failed, and she decided that was acceptable. "The investigation is just beginning," she said, because that was practical and true, and she needed to say something grounded. "They may push back. The company will have lawyers." "Let them," Silas said, lifting his head. His eyes were bright. "Let them push back against a county investigation with 6 ranchers' testimony and 60-some documents. See how far that gets them." She almost smiled. She did smile, actually. She couldn't help it. Elias watched her smile, and something happened in his expression that she had never seen there before, open and unguarded for just a moment, like a window briefly left without a curtain. He looked away before she could name it, but she had seen it. And she filed it away quietly, the way she filed everything, because information was useful, and she had learned never to throw any of it away. Silas stood up from the table with a steadiness that had been returning to him week by week and said, "I'm going outside." "I want to walk the north field. It's cold," Elias said. "I've been cold before," Silas said, and got his coat and walked out the door. They heard his boots on the porch steps, heard the creak of the yard gate. Then nothing. Elias and Clara stood in the kitchen alone, and the letter lay on the table between them and outside. Silas Whitaker was walking the fields of his own ranch for the first time in 2 years. "He's going to be all right," Clara said. She hadn't planned to say it. "It came from someplace below planning. Because of you," Elias said. "Because of himself," she said. "He just needed someone to stop treating him like he was already gone." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you do?" he said. "Find the people that everyone else has already written off and remind them they're still here." She thought about that honestly. She thought about Silas and his empty bowl and the door she'd knocked on in the dark. She thought about 37 letters in a box belonging to a man who was too angry and too ashamed to show them to anyone. She thought about what she herself had been when she arrived, a woman with $12 and soaked boots, and no one in the world who was expecting her to arrive anywhere. "I don't know if that's a plan," she said. "It's just what I see. When I look at a person, I see what they're capable of, not what they've lost." She paused. "It's a habit. I can't turn it off." He was looking at her steadily, and she could feel the weight of it, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet. "What do you see?" he said slowly. "When you look at me?" She held his gaze. It was a significant question, and he had asked it quietly, without deflection, the way a man asks when he genuinely wants the answer. "I see someone who has been managing everything alone for so long that he's forgotten it doesn't have to be that way," she said. He was very still. "And I see," she added, more quietly, "that he's starting to remember." She picked up the letter from the table, folded it carefully, and set it where the important documents were kept. She went to the stove. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she was grateful to have something to do with them. Behind her, Elias didn't move for a long moment. Then she heard him take a breath, slow and deliberate, and pull out the chair and sit down. Not to leave. Just to stay, in the kitchen, in the warmth, without having anywhere he needed to be right now. That was new, too. And outside, Silas was walking the north field in the cold, and the mountains stood where they always had, and the Whitaker Ranch held its ground, the way it had always held its ground, stubborn and solid, refusing to be less than what it was. The investigation changed things in ways Clara had not fully anticipated. She had expected the relief. She had expected Silas to breathe easier, and Elias to stand a little straighter, and the ranch hands to sense that something had shifted and carry themselves accordingly. All of that happened exactly as expected in the days following Gerald Fitch's letter. What she had not expected was the speed of the company's response. 4 days after the investigation was announced, 2 men arrived at the Whitaker Ranch gate on horseback. They did not ride in the way visitors rode in with the easy approach of people who have nothing to hide. They stopped at the gate and waited, which was the particular posture of men who know they are not welcome and are making a point of coming anyway. Elias saw them from the barn. He walked to the gate himself, which Clara watched from the kitchen window, and she watched the conversation happen 3 minutes, maybe 4, with Elias standing very still and the 2 men on horseback doing most of the talking. When they rode away, Elias stood at the gate for a moment with his back to the house before he turned and came inside. She had coffee ready when he came through the door. She had learned to read his pace. "Who were they?" she said. "Lawyers," he said, "or men who claimed to be." He sat down and wrapped his hands around the mug. "They said the company is prepared to offer a settlement. Drop the investigation, accept modified terms on the land agreements, and in exchange they'll reduce the amount of acreage they're claiming. They want you to trade away part of the ranch to make the rest of the problem disappear," Clara said. "That's the polite version of it, yes. What did you tell them?" He looked up at her. I told them to get off my property. She exhaled. Good. They said they'd be back with a formal offer. They won't, she said. That visit was to see how frightened you are. To measure the resistance. If you'd hesitated or asked questions or said you'd think about it, they would have come back with papers the next morning. She sat down across from him. You told them no clearly and immediately. They'll go back and report that, and they'll try a different approach. He studied her. How do you know that? Because it's what Crane did, she said simply. When I told him what I'd found, he sent someone to my door the next day not to threaten, to offer. A small increase in wages, a different title, something that made it seem like he was addressing the problem without actually addressing it. She kept her voice even. The offer is never about solving the problem. It's about making you feel heard enough to stop pushing. Elias nodded slowly. We need to tell Fitch I'll write it down today. The men, what they said, how they said it, exactly how the offer was framed. She was already reaching for paper. If they approach the other ranchers the same way, we need to know about it. I'll ride to Orville's this afternoon. Take Pete Alderman with you, she said. He's the one they're least likely to intimidate, and most likely to have already turned someone away. Elias stood. He paused at the door. You think like a general, he said. I think like someone who has lost before, she said. It's the same thing, just with more humility. He left. She started writing. Silas came to the kitchen an hour later, moving with the steadiness that had been rebuilding in him week by week, and he sat down at the table and looked at her writing without asking what it was. He had learned her working silences by now. The men at the gate, he said. You saw them. I'm old, not blind. He folded his hands on the table. They're pushing back, yes. And you're not worried, he said, watching her. She stopped writing and looked at him directly. I'm alert, she said. There's a difference. He nodded. That's what Margaret used to say. He was quiet for a moment. She wasn't afraid of much either, not because she was reckless. Because she understood the difference between a thing worth fearing and a thing worth fighting. He paused. She would have said those two men at the gate were the second kind. She was right, Clara said. Silas looked at her for a long moment. What is it you're afraid of, he said, if anything? It was the kind of question that would have made most people deflect. She didn't. Doing everything right and still losing, she said. Building the best case possible with everything available, presenting it cleanly and honestly, and still having it not be enough because the other side has more money or more influence or better connections. She set her pencil down. I've seen that happen. It's not the most common outcome, but it happens. And the people it happens to don't recover easily. Silas was quiet for a moment. But you're still fighting. Because not fighting guarantees the worst outcome, she said. At least this way there's a chance. He reached across the table and put his hand on her wrist. A brief, deliberate gesture. You've been fighting since before you came here, he said. On your own, without anyone at your back, he held her gaze. You have people at your back now, all of us. I want you to know that. She looked at him. She was for a moment, not entirely composed, and she didn't try to hide it. Thank you, she said, quietly and completely. He nodded and reached for the coffee pot and refilled his mug and said, Now write faster. We probably don't have as much time as we'd like. And she almost laughed and picked up her pencil and went back to work. The different approach the company tried came not through lawyers this time. It came through a woman. She arrived in Colton 3 days later and introduced herself to the boarding house keeper, to the general store owner, and to the minister's wife as a correspondent from a Denver newspaper, interested in writing a piece about the Valley's ranching families. She was well-dressed, pleasant, and very good at asking questions that sounded like neighborly conversation. Clara found out about her through Mrs. Hennessy, the same boarding house owner who had originally pointed her toward the Whitaker Ranch, who sent a note to the ranch with one of the supply riders, saying that someone in town was asking a great many questions about a woman named Clara Bellamy, and was doing it in the particular way of someone who already knew what answer they were looking for. She read the note at the kitchen table while Elias stood behind her and read it over her shoulder. She could feel the tension in him before he said a word. "They're still trying to discredit you," he said. "Yes." Through a woman pretending to be a journalist. "It's a clever approach," she said, setting the note down. "They sent another lawyer. It reads as intimidation." A friendly woman asking neighborly questions is harder to object to. "What is she asking?" he said. "According to Mrs. Hennessy, my background. Whether I have family, whether anyone knows why I left Missouri, whether I was dismissed from a position there." She kept her voice neutral. The usual shape of it. Build enough ambiguity around the person who built the case and the case starts to seem less reliable. Elias pulled out the chair beside her and sat. He turned so he was looking at her directly. "Tell me everything about Crane," he said. "Everything you told me to write down. Tell it to me now, out loud." She looked at him. "Because I'm going to ride into Colton tomorrow," he said. "And I'm going to find whoever this woman is, and I'm going to tell her exactly who you are and what you did. And I want to make sure I have every detail right." "Elias, you've been fighting this on paper," he said. "Let me fight this part. You don't have to. I know I don't have to." His voice was very steady. "Tell me about Crane." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without blinking. And she could see in his face the quality she had first recognized as stubbornness, and had since come to understand was something more specific. It was the particular determination of a man who has decided what is right, and is not interested in being argued away from it. She told him about Crane. She started from the beginning, from the day she had noticed the first discrepancy in the accounts, through the months of careful tracking, through the confrontation and the dismissal, and the ruined references and the slow, grinding isolation that came from living in a town that had decided to take the word of a prominent businessman over a bookkeeper who had gotten too close to the truth. She told him about leaving the copies with the business partners. She told him about the 4 months she had spent trying to stay and fight before she admitted that she was out of options and out of time, and the only direction left was forward. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without the restless impatience that people sometimes showed when they were waiting for the point. His eyes never left her face. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. "And Crane is still operating in St. Joseph," he said. "As far as I know. Did the partners ever act on the documents you left them?" "I don't know. I never heard." He nodded slowly. He stood. "I'm going to Colton in the morning," he said. "And then I'm going to send a letter to St. Joseph, Elias." She stood as well, because she didn't want to have this conversation from different heights. "What I told you about Crane, I told you so you'd understand the background. Not so you'd go to war on my behalf. I'm not going to war," he said. "I'm going to tell the truth. You seem to be a strong advocate for that approach." She stared at him. "That was my own advice," she said. "I know," he said. "You're good at it. I'm borrowing it." She opened her mouth and closed it again. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He went out. She stood in the kitchen alone and looked at the door he had closed behind him and felt something she had been very carefully not feeling for the past several weeks push its way to the surface before she could stop it. She sat back down. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She told herself, clearly and firmly, that she was an employee of this ranch and that Elias Whitaker was a practical man who was protecting the integrity of the case, and that was all this was. And she believed about 60% of it, and 60% would have to be sufficient. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. In the morning, Elias rode to Colton before she was up, which she knew because his horse was gone from the barn when she went out at 4:30. She made breakfast for Silas and the hands and did not explain where Elias was, because she didn't know exactly what he was going to do, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. He came back at midday. He came through the kitchen door and hung up his coat and sat down at the table, and she put food in front of him and waited. "I found her," he said, "at the general store. She was very pleasant." She introduced herself as a correspondent for the Rocky Mountain Register. He cut into the food without looking up. "I told her I was from the Whitaker Ranch and that I understood she'd been asking about a woman named Clara Bellamy." He paused. She confirmed she had. What did you tell her? Clara asked. He looked up. I told her that Clara Bellamy arrived at my ranch 6 weeks ago with nothing but a leather satchel and a set of skills that most people in this county haven't got, and that she single-handedly uncovered a fraud scheme that had been stealing land from mountain ranchers for over 2 years, and that she organized the evidence and presented it to the county office in a way that was so thorough the county attorney opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks of receiving it. He held her gaze. I told her that anyone who wanted to question Miss Bellamy's character was welcome to put their questions in writing and send them to the Whitaker Ranch, and I'd answer them personally. Clara was very still, and then I told her that the Rocky Mountain Register probably didn't know one of their correspondents was in Colton Valley, asking loaded questions on behalf of a land company under investigation for fraud, but that I was happy to write to their editor if she thought that would be helpful. She's not actually from the paper, Clara said. No, he said. She left town this afternoon. The store owner saw her go. Clara sat down slowly. You bluffed I stated a possibility, he said. There's a difference. She stared at him. You've been listening to me too long. Probably, he said, and went back to his food. She sat across from him and looked at her own hands on the table and felt 60% becoming something considerably larger. And she decided this was a problem for a different day because there was still an investigation running, and a land company that had not given up, and a case that was not yet won. Thank you, she said. You're welcome, he said, as if it were a simple thing, as if he had done something ordinary rather than riding into town and standing up for her in front of a stranger when no one had asked him to. She picked up her coffee. He ate his food. Outside, Silas was in the barn talking to the hands, his voice carrying across the yard, steady and certain and increasingly present. This was what she had not anticipated when she walked 8 miles through snow to knock on a stranger's door, that surviving would look like this. Like a kitchen table, and a man eating lunch across from her, and an old man's voice in the yard, and a county investigation that was slowly pulling the ground back from under the people who had thought they could take it. 2 weeks after the fake correspondent left Colton, Gerald Fitch sent another letter. This one was longer. Clara read it first because she was the one who processed the mail. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, and by the 3rd paragraph, her hands were not entirely steady. She went to find Elias. He was in the far barn working with a young horse that had been giving him trouble, a gray 3-year-old with more will than sense. She stood at the barn entrance and said his name, and something in her voice made him hand the lead line to the nearest ranch hand without a word and walk over to her. She gave him the letter. He read it. She watched his face. The county investigation had expanded. What had begun as a review of the Whitaker Ranch documents had, through cross-referencing with other county records and inquiry with the state land office, uncovered a pattern that reached beyond the valley. The Western Territorial Land and Improvement Company had been operating similar schemes in at least 4 other counties across Colorado and Wyoming. The state attorney's office had been notified. A man named Harlan Cross, the same name Silas had given Clara 6 weeks earlier, had been identified as the primary agent responsible for the fraudulent filings and was currently being sought for questioning. The Whitaker Ranch's land claims were formally cleared. All agreements between the Western Territorial Land and Improvement Company and the Whitaker family were declared null and void on the basis of fraud and falsification. No part of their land had ever legally left their ownership. Elias read to the bottom of the letter and stood very still. Clara waited. He folded the letter. He looked at her. It's over, he said. The land part is over, she said carefully. The state case will go on for a while. They may need statements from us again. Cross has to be found, and Clara.
His voice was quiet.
It's over. She stopped. He was looking at her with the window without curtain look again, and this time he didn't look away. We need to tell your father, she said. Yes, he said. He didn't move. I know, he said. I know what this means. I know what happens next. I know there are still things to do. He paused. I just need 1 minute. She gave him 1 minute. She stood at the barn entrance while he stood a few feet away, with the letter folded in his hands, and the gray 3-year-old watching both of them with large suspicious eyes, and she let the minute be what it needed to be for him. Because she understood that kind of moment, the one where the thing you have been fighting toward finally arrives and you need a breath to absorb it before you can move. Then she said, "Ready?" "Yes," he said. They walked to the house together. Silas was at the kitchen table. He looked up when they came in and read both their faces and set down his coffee mug very carefully. "Tell me," he said. Elias set the letter in front of him. Silas read it. He read it through once without expression, and then he read it again more slowly, and Clara watched his hands on the table, those large, capable hands that had built this ranch and signed the documents he thought were protecting it, and spent 2 years curled in on themselves with shame, slowly flatten against the wood, as if he needed to feel something solid. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He did not apologize for it. He was not that kind of man. "Margaret," he said softly, and it was not a word to either of them. It was the word of a man speaking to someone who was not in the room but whom he felt with certainty was still present in some way. "We kept it." Elias sat down next to his father. He put his hand on the old man's shoulder, and Silas put his hand over his son's hand, and the two of them sat there for a moment in the way of men who have been through something together and don't need to say much about it. Clara stood at the stove with her back to the room and gave them the moment, because it was theirs, and because she needed a moment herself. And because the stove was there, and she could do something useful with her hands while she got herself together. She heard Silas say, "This is because of her." She heard Elias say, "I know." She kept her eyes on the stove. "She should know that we know it," Silas said. "I'll tell her," Elias said. "Tell me now," Clara said. "I can hear you." A pause. Then Silas laughed, a real laugh this time, full and clear, the laugh of a man whose chest has been opened up again after being shut for too long, and Elias made a sound she had never heard from him before, low and warm and surprised. She turned around. They were both looking at her, Silas with shining eyes and the face of a man 20 years younger than he'd been 6 weeks ago, and Elias with the expression she had been carefully not letting herself name, the open one. The one that was not careful or controlled, but simply real. "Thank you," Silas said, "for all of it, for walking through that door. For the stew, because that's where it started. For staying when it got hard. For fighting for us when you had every reason to keep moving and look after yourself." He stopped. His voice had gotten rough. "I didn't know how to keep living after Margaret. You reminded me that it was still worth doing." Clara looked at him and felt something open in her chest that she had been keeping shut for a long time, not with force, just with the practical understanding that she had been alone and self-sufficient, and that was what was required. She had stopped expecting to be seen. She had stopped expecting anyone to say her name like it mattered. "You're a good man, Silas Whitaker," she said. Her voice was very steady, which cost her something. "You were always worth the fight. You just needed someone to tell you." He nodded once. He pressed the letter flat on the table with both hands, and then he stood, with a firmness that was entirely his own, and said he was going to walk the property, because he felt like it, and he put on his coat and went outside. The kitchen was very quiet. Elias had not moved from his chair. He was looking at the table. "She would have liked you," he said. "Eleanor. She was like you in some ways. Not in personality." Eleanor was louder, laughed more. "But in the way she paid attention. The way she looked at people and saw what they were capable of instead of what they'd done wrong." He paused. "I'd forgotten that was a thing people could do. You reminded me." Clara came to the table. She sat down across from him. Not behind the work, not with papers between them, just at the table. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "Where are you planning to go?" She was quiet for a moment. She had not actually let herself think about this, had deliberately not thought about it. Because thinking about it required acknowledging that her presence here had always been predicated on usefulness, and the usefulness had a shape, and the shape was not infinite. "I hadn't decided," she said carefully. "The investigation is settled," he said. "The land is cleared, the house is running." He held her gaze. "By any practical measure, You've finished what you came here to do." "Yes," she said. "That's not what I asked," he said. "I asked where you're planning to go." She looked at him. "I don't think you should go anywhere," he said. And then, because he was not a man who did things obliquely when he could do them directly, "I think you should stay. Not as the housekeeper, not as the bookkeeper, not as the person who holds the case together or keeps the kitchen running." He paused. "As someone who belongs here, if you want to belong somewhere." The kitchen was completely silent. She thought about the boarding house in Silverton. She thought about the 4 months in Missouri, trying to stay in a place that had decided she wasn't worth it. She thought about 8 miles of snow and a door she had almost not knocked on. She thought about a bowl of stew and an old man's eyes and a cowboy who slammed his fist on the table and roared who cooked this, and then sat alone at the kitchen table and finished the whole bowl and said nothing to anyone. "I want to belong somewhere," she said. He nodded. Once the nod of a man who has made a decision and is not changing it. "Then stay," he said. She held his gaze across the table. "All right," she said. And outside, Silas Whitaker was walking the north field of his ranch in the cold mountain air, and the land held firm beneath his boots, and for the first time in 2 years he walked without the weight of a thing he thought he'd lost. And above him the Colorado sky was enormous and clean and entirely itself. She stayed. It was not an announcement. There was no ceremony around it. No formal declaration beyond the quiet word she had given him at the kitchen table. But the morning after that conversation, when Elias came through the kitchen at 5 and found her at the stove as she always was, something between them had shifted, not dramatically. Not in any way that anyone watching would have been able to point to specifically, but real the way the change in air pressure before a storm is real, felt before it is seen. He said good morning. She handed him coffee. He sat down at the table instead of taking it to go. That was new. That was the shift made visible. Silas noticed at breakfast. He looked at Elias sitting at the table and Clara moving around the kitchen without the particular careful distance she had maintained for 6 weeks. And he said nothing at all, which was louder than anything he could have said. The days that followed were the quietest kind of change, the kind that happens not in single dramatic moments but in the accumulation of small ordinary ones. Elias began leaving his coat on the hook, closest to the stove, because that was where Clara's coat was, and there was no reason for his to be on the other side of the door anymore. He started staying at the kitchen table in the evenings after supper, instead of disappearing to the barn or the office, and Clara stayed too, and they talked about the ranch, about the investigation's ongoing progress, about things that were further from either of those subjects than they had ever allowed themselves to go before. She learned that he had grown up wanting to be somewhere else, and had stayed because his father needed him, and had gradually, somewhere in his late 20s, stopped wanting to be somewhere else, and started wanting exactly the place he was. She learned that he had taught himself to read properly at 19 from a stack of books his wife had brought into the marriage, and that Eleanor had found this more amusing than he had. She learned that he was capable of laughing at himself, which she had suspected but not seen evidence of, until the evening he told her about a cattle-moving incident 3 years prior that had gone so thoroughly wrong in such a specific sequence of avoidable catastrophes that she laughed until her eyes watered, and he sat across from her with that barely there smile and watched her laugh and looked, for a moment, like a man who could not believe his own good fortune. She learned that he had been lonelier than he admitted to anyone, including himself. She learned this not because he said it directly. He was constitutionally incapable of saying something like that directly, but because of the way he existed differently in the kitchen now. The way he stayed. The way he asked questions and waited for the full answer instead of moving on before she finished. The way he had started saying her name at the beginning of a sentence when he didn't strictly need to. The way people say the name of something they want to make sure is real. She was not immune to it. She was trying to be sensible, which was harder in the evenings than in the mornings, and easier when there was work in front of her than when the work was done, and the lamp was burning low, and it was just the two of them at the table with the quiet ranch house around them. She told herself she was being careful. She told herself that careful was appropriate. She had been here 2 months, which was not enough time to stake anything permanent on, and she was aware acutely, almost painfully aware of the difference between being needed and being wanted, because she had spent enough of her life being the former, while the latter evaporated. Silas predictably had no patience for her caution. He did not say so directly either. He was in that respect very much his son's father. But one morning in January, when Clara was in the kitchen and Elias had ridden out to the east pasture with the hands, Silas came and sat at the table and looked at her with the eyes of a man who has decided to say something he has been holding for a while. "You're still waiting," he said. She looked up from her work. "Waiting for what?" "For it to stop being real," he said. "For the part where it turns out, this isn't what it looks like." She set her pencil down. "You've been watching me," she said. "I've been watching both of you," he said. "I'm old and I have nothing better to do, and you are both extremely stubborn in ways that are going to take 10 years off my remaining life." He folded his hands on the table. "Clara, that boy has been alone inside himself since Eleanor died. He kept the ranch running, and he took care of me, and he did everything that needed doing. But he was alone in the way that matters, and he has not been that way since you came through that door." She was quiet. "I know your history," he said, "Thomas. Crane, Missouri. All of it. I know what it costs a person to trust something that looks good when they've had good-looking things taken from them before." He paused. "But you're smarter than your fear. You know the difference between a thing that's real and a thing that isn't. You've made a living out of knowing that difference." "This is not a ledger," she said quietly. "No," he said. "It's not. It's better than a ledger, and it's harder. But you know what you're looking at." He held her gaze. "Don't let fear do the accounting on this one." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a remarkable man, Silas Whitaker," she said. "I know," he said simply, and reached for his coffee. She sat with what he said for 3 days, which was how long it took before something happened that made sitting with it quietly impossible. The letter arrived from St. Joseph on a Thursday. It was addressed to Clara, which was already unusual because almost nothing came addressed to her, and the handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar. She opened it at the kitchen counter and read it standing, and by the second paragraph her hand was gripping the counter edge. It was from a man named Robert Aldine, one of the 2 business partners she had left the anonymous documents for when she fled Missouri 14 months ago. He had somehow found her, through what chain of inquiry she couldn't immediately reconstruct, and he had written to tell her what had happened after she left. Crane had been investigated. Not immediately, it had taken several months, but Aldine had taken the documents she left and brought them to a lawyer, and the lawyer had found grounds, and eventually the full extent of what Crane had been doing came out. Crane had been forced to dissolve the partnership under terms that compensated both Aldine and the other partner for what they'd lost. He was no longer operating in St. Joseph. The business had been restructured under new ownership. That was the first thing the letter told her. The second thing was harder. Aldine wrote that he had always suspected the documents had come from her, that there was only one person in Crane's operation who would have known what to look for and how to present it, and he was writing because he wanted her to know that what she had done mattered, even though she had done it without knowing if it ever would, and that if she ever needed a reference, a genuine one, from someone who knew her actual work and her actual character, he would provide one without hesitation. She stood at the counter for a long time after she finished reading. What she had done in Missouri had not dissolved into silence the way she had believed. The documents she had left in the dark, not knowing if they would ever see daylight, had done the thing she had hoped they would do and had not let herself believe. She thought about the choice she had made on her last night in St. Joseph to leave the truth behind for people she couldn't be sure would use it, to do the right thing without any guarantee of return. She thought about how much harder it was to do the right thing when you weren't going to be there, to see the outcome. She was still standing at the counter when Elias came through the door. He read her face the way he had learned to read it quickly and accurately and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched him read it and watched his face move through several things in sequence, understanding. Then something that looked like anger on her behalf at the picture of her leaving documents anonymously for people she wasn't sure would believe her. Then something quieter and more complicated that settled into his features as he reached the end. He looked up. "You didn't know if any of it worked," he said. "When you left," she said, "and you left the documents anyway." "It was the right thing to do," she said, "whether or not anyone did anything with them." He looked at her with an expression that was completely unguarded, all the control he habitually kept between himself and the world temporarily set aside. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said, because she could hear what was coming, and she was not sure she was ready to hold it together through it. "I'm going to say it anyway," he said. "You walked away from a fight that was already costing you everything, and you still left the truth behind, for people who never even acknowledged you. You walked 8 miles in the snow to knock on a stranger's door, because forward was the only direction left. And then you found out this ranch was being stolen and you built the case to stop it, and you did it quietly and methodically and without once asking for anything in return except the room off the kitchen." He stopped. He set the letter on the counter. "I have met a lot of people in my life. I have not met anyone like you." She looked at him. "What exactly are you saying?" she said, because she believed in directness, and she was not going to let this be something she misread. "I'm saying I love you," he said. The way he said it was the way he did everything, without decoration, without performance. Just the plain fact of it, offered straight across the distance between them. "I have been trying not to say it for about a month because I thought it was too fast, and I didn't put pressure on something you were still deciding about. But you're still deciding, and I'm done waiting, and I would rather say it, and have you tell me it's too soon than not say it, and have you think it isn't true." The kitchen was completely silent. Clara looked at him across the counter with the letter from Missouri, between them and 6 weeks of mornings and evenings and kitchen table conversations, and 37 letters in a box, and a county investigation and a bowl of stew that had started. All of it, and she felt the last of the careful distance she had been maintaining collapse like a wall that had been undermined from below for a long time, and had finally, simply, given way. "It's not too soon," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to hold his gaze, and he looked at her the way he had been trying not to look at her for a month, openly, completely, without the managed restraint. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I told you I was staying." "I know," he said. "I just needed to tell you why I wanted you to." She put her hand against his chest, feeling the solid reality of him, and he put his hand over hers and held it there, and that was the moment, not the letter, not the county investigation, not the stew, not the first night at the kitchen table. That was the moment the thing between them became unmistakably, permanently real. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway approximately 4 minutes later, stopped, assessed the situation with the rapid accuracy of a man who had been expecting this for some time, said finally in a tone of profound satisfaction, and walked back down the hall. Elias looked at the doorway where his father had been. "He's been watching us for a month," Clara said. "I know," Elias said. "He told me not to let fear do the accounting," she said. Elias looked at her. "He said that, word for word?" "He's a remarkable man," Elias said. "That's exactly what I told him," she said. He almost laughed. It was real full and warm and surprised. The same sound she had heard in the kitchen the night of the cattle story, and it undid her completely in the best possible way. What followed was not simple, because nothing real ever is. The state investigation into the Western Territorial Land and Improvement Company stretched into spring, and both Elias and Clara were called to provide additional statements twice. Harlan Cross was found in Wyoming in March, attempting to file similar fraudulent claims in a different county under a slightly different company name, and his arrest sent a ripple through the valley that resulted in 2 more ranching families coming forward with documents they had been afraid to show anyone. Clara helped them too. She didn't think of it as a choice, it simply was what she did, the way breathing was what she did. She sat at the kitchen table with a rancher named Delia Marsh, a widow in her 60s who had been fighting a false claim on her water rights for 8 months alone. And she went through every document Delia had, and found the thread that unraveled the whole thing inside an afternoon. Delia Marsh looked at her across the table when she finished and said, "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," Clara said. "That's not right. Bring me your recipe for apple preserves," Clara said. "I've been trying to get the right balance and I can't manage it." Delia looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled the smile of a woman who recognized another woman speaking her language. She brought the recipe 2 weeks later. It was the best apple preserve Clara had ever tasted, and she told her so, and Delia came back the following month for no reason, except to sit at the Whitaker kitchen table and talk, and somehow after that she just kept coming. And Orville Potts's wife Ruth came with her one time and stayed for 3 hours. And the kitchen that had been empty and silent for so long began to fill with the sound of people who had found their way to each other through the particular geography of hard times and mutual survival. Silas presided over all of it with barely concealed delight. He had resumed a role that suited him deeply, the patriarch of a household with actual life in it, and he was more himself with each passing week than he had been in years. He went back to managing sections of the ranch operation, not everything, not the way he once had, but enough to feel useful and present and connected to the land he had built his life on. One afternoon in early April, Clara came to find him in the barn and found him teaching one of the younger ranch hands how to assess the health of a cafe patient, and specific, and clearly in possession of knowledge that the younger man was absorbing with visible gratitude and. She stood at the barn entrance and watched it, and thought about the man she had found, sitting in a chair by a window, waiting to finish dying. He caught her looking. "What? Nothing," she said. "You look well. I feel well," he said, with the directness of a man who has stopped taking that for granted. "Now what did you come out here for? Elias wants to know if you're joining us for supper or if he needs to bring something out." "I'll come in," he said. He handed the lead rope to the ranch hand with a final word of instruction, and he walked toward Clara, and his step was steady, and his back was straight, and his eyes were clear. She walked beside him back to the house. "Are you happy?" he asked. She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "You should be. You built this." "We all built it," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You started it. The stew and everything after. We were sitting in the dark and you walked in and turned the light on." He paused. "I know my son. He would have kept running this ranch until he ran out of years, and never once admitted he was lonely. You changed that. You changed all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "He changed it," she said. "He let me stay." Silas looked at her sideways. "You think that was nothing? Letting someone in after everything?" He shook his head again. "That took more from him than anything I've ever seen him do. And he did it because you were worth it. Don't sell yourself short on that." She had no answer for that, and she was glad they had reached the porch, because she needed the door to open and the kitchen to be in front of her, and something practical to do with her hands. Elias was already inside. He had started the fire and put water on, and was standing at the counter looking at something she had left there, the letter from Aldine, which she had kept, folded and reread several times until the fold lines were soft. He set it down when they came in. "Supper," he said. "Give me 20 minutes, she said. He nodded and went to the table, and Silas sat down across from him, and they began to talk the way they talked now, easily, with the quality of two people who had been through something together and had come out closer on the other side of it. She moved around the kitchen and listened to them, and felt the warmth of the stove and the lamp and the sound of voices that filled the room without effort. This was what she had not known to want, this specific, ordinary, entirely extraordinary thing. In May, when the last frost came off the ground and the valley began to green, Elias asked her to marry him. He did it the way he did everything important, without preamble, without performance, at the kitchen table after supper, while Silas was conveniently and very deliberately in the barn. He said, "I have been thinking about how to say this properly for a month, and I don't think there's a proper way, so I'm just going to say it. I want to marry you. I want you to be here not because you work here or because we need you, but because this is your home and I am yours, and that's the shape I want the rest of my life to have." She looked at him across the table. His hands were flat on the wood, which she had learned was what he did when he was being completely honest and a little bit terrified. "Yes," she said. He exhaled a long, slow breath that told her exactly how much he had been holding. "That's it," he said. "You asked a clear question," she said. It deserved a clear answer. He reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was steady and certain. "I love you," he said. "I should say it more often." "You say it the right amount," she said. "When you say it, I know you mean it." He turned her hand over and held it in both of his. They sat like that for a while. Silas came back in from the barn in about 20 minutes and stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them at the table and said, "Well?" She said, "Yes," Elias said. Silas put his hand on the doorframe and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were bright. "Good," he said. His voice was rough. "Good. Now someone put supper on before I say something sentimental." Clara stood up and went to the stove, and behind her she heard Silas sit down and say to Elias in a low voice, "Margaret knows." "I'd bet everything on it." And she heard Elias say quietly, "I know, Dad." And she kept her back to them, and her hands moving, and let the two of them have that moment in peace. They were married in June, in the front room of the ranch house with Gerald Fitch and his wife, Orville and Ruth Potts, Pete Alderman and Delia Marsh present, and a minister who had ridden in from Colton and who said, when it was done, that he had never officiated a wedding in a kitchen quite as warm as this one, and meant it as the highest compliment. Silas stood beside Elias and was steady the whole time, and when it was finished he shook his son's hand, and then held Clara's hand in both of his for a long moment and said only, "Welcome home," and that was all that needed saying. The summer that followed was the summer the Whitaker Ranch became something different in the valley's understanding of itself. Not because of the land settlement, though that was remembered. Not because of the investigation, though the story of how 6 ranching families had come together with a woman's organized evidence and dismantled a fraudulent scheme was told and retold through the county for years. It was because of what the ranch had become in simpler ways. The kitchen that was never empty now, the table where people sat when they needed to think something through. The way Ruth Potts had started bringing new women to that table when they needed what she described, accurately, as someone who knows how to look at a problem without flinching. The way the ranch hands talked about the place not just as a job, but as somewhere they chose to be. Clara did not set out to build any of that. She set out to find a room and a wage and somewhere to stand while she rebuilt her footing. What grew around her was not planned. It was the natural result of a woman who knew how to pay attention, and how to fight, and how to feed people, and how to sit with them in their hard hours without looking away. One evening in late August, they were at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, the way they were most evenings, and Elias was telling his father about a new section of fence he was planning for the north boundary. And Clara was half listening and half reading a letter from Delia Marsh about a woman in the next county who needed help with a property dispute. And the lamp was burning, and the house was warm, and outside the mountains were doing whatever the mountains did in August. Silas looked at Clara and said, "Out of nowhere, do you miss Missouri?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about Thomas, who had been good and kind and gone too soon. She thought about the store and the books and the life she had built and then lost. She thought about the boarding house, and the coach, and the 8 miles in the snow, and the door she had stood in front of with her hand raised. "I miss Thomas," she said. "Sometimes, the way you miss something that was real and good and isn't there anymore." She paused. "But I don't miss Missouri. Missouri was a place I was. This is a place I'm from." Silas nodded slowly as if she had confirmed something he had already known. Elias looked up from the map he had been studying and looked at her across the table. She met his eyes. "From," he said quietly, repeating the word the way he had once repeated her name, trying it out, finding it accurate, keeping it. "From," she said. Outside, the San Juan Mountains stood where they had always stood and would always stand, enormous and indifferent, and in their indifference somehow magnificent. The kind of landscape that does not care who you were before you arrived, and does not remember the version of yourself you left behind somewhere else, but simply holds you in it if you choose to stay. And Clara Bellamy Whitaker had chosen to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go. That had been true once, and it was not true anymore. She had a letter from Robert Aldean in a drawer with the offer of a reference attached. She had skills that were wanted in more than one place. She had options, real ones, that had not existed when she first walked through that door. She stayed because she had built something here worth staying for. Because an old man had opened his door to her in the cold, and a bowl of stew had brought a grieving man back to the table, and a stack of documents had given a family back their land. And somewhere in all of that she had been given back herself, the full version, the one that knew her own worth and did not apologize for it, and did not wait for anyone's permission to occupy the space she deserved. She stayed because Elias Whitaker had sat across a kitchen table and told her the plain truth of what he felt, and held her hand in both of his and said, "This is your home." And she had believed him, and she had been right to. She stayed because when you find the place where the broken parts of you are not hidden but held, where the hardest chapters of your life are not used against you, but understood as the thing that made you exactly who you needed to be, you don't leave that place. You build it into something that lasts, and the Whitaker Ranch lasted. And Clara was the reason why, and she knew it, and she no longer needed to be quiet about knowing it. She was home. That was the only word for it, and it was enough, and it was everything.